They told her she was broken. They were wrong. She was the only thing holding the world together. For 14 years, Mara hid something inside her chest that could reduce an entire kingdom to white ash and frozen silence. She smiled. She kept her eyes brown. She breathed. And nobody knew. Not the council, who chained her in silver and called her a threat. Not the enemies who hunted her across 3 territories for 3 years. Not even the Alpha who swore he would die before anyone touched her. Nobody knew what she actually was. Until the night they pushed her too far. Until the night she let them see it. And in 4 seconds, 12 of the most powerful wolves on the eastern continent pressed themselves against the walls of their own chamber like frightened children. The silver chains did not break. They dissolved. They ceased to exist. And the fallen Alpha, the man who had charged into that fortress with 2 knives and the absolute intention of burning it to the ground to save her, that man went completely still in the upper gallery. Because he realized in that moment that he had not come here to save her. He had come here to watch her save herself. But here is what nobody tells you. The girl in the chains was not the most terrifying thing in that room. The most terrifying thing was what she was still holding back. What she had always been holding back. Every single day. Since she was 8 years old. And somewhere on a frozen moor, at the edge of everything, a man named Aldrich Vane had spent 3 years and every resource he owned trying to own that power. He built a prison around it. He weaponized a child to get to her. He put 9 corrupted council elders at his back and waited for her to run out of options. He had planned for a weapon. He had not planned for what she actually was. What happens in the next 4 minutes of this story will make you put your phone down. Not because it is violent. Not because it is shocking. Because it is the moment a girl who has been breathing through the weight of the world since she was 8 years old finally stops apologizing for how large she is. And the man who fell from the highest rank in the Eastern Territory, who was stripped and broken and silenced by the very council she just brought to its knees. That man looks at her across a frozen moorland in the early morning light and feels, for the first time in 14 months, the ground beneath his feet. Because the ending of this story is not what you think it is. It is not a battle. It is not a war. It is something rarer than both of those things. It is the moment the world remembers what it was always supposed to be. And you will not see it coming. Nobody ever does. The chains hit the stone floor like a death sentence. Mara did not flinch. She stood in the center of the council chamber with her wrists bound in silver-laced iron. Her bare feet sinking into the freezing mud that seeped between the ancient flagstones, and she did not give them the satisfaction of a single tremor. The chamber smelled of burning pine resin and old blood. 12 council elders sat in a horseshoe formation above her, their ceremonial robes the deep burgundy of a wound that would not close, their eyes carrying the particular coldness of men who had sentenced hundreds before her and slept soundly afterward. Elder Voss leaned forward, his knuckles white against the obsidian railing. "Mara of the Ashbone Pack," he said, and his voice filled the chamber like smoke filling a sealed room. "You stand accused of harboring a corrupted gift, a power deemed unnatural by the laws written at the first convergence." She said nothing. The pine torches on the walls guttered in a wind that had no business being inside. High above the circular chamber, pressed into the shadow of the upper gallery where the condemned were not supposed to have visitors, stood Kale, the fallen Alpha. He did not belong here. He had been stripped of his title 14 months ago in a ceremony designed to break him. His beta bonds severed one by one, each snap audible to every wolf within a mile radius, each one leaving a scar across his chest that still ached in cold weather. The council believed they had broken him. They had made the error of confusing silence for surrender. Kale's silver eyes tracked every elder in that room with the methodical calm of a predator cataloging threats, and the scent of pine sap and cold iron that clung to him, the particular smell of barely restrained wolf, was something only Mara could detect from where she stood below. She had always been able to detect him. That was, in fact, the problem. Elder Voss rose from his seat and descended the 3 stone steps toward her. His robes whispering against the mud, a ceremonial blade in his right hand. Silver, as tradition demanded, as cruelty always found a way to dress itself in tradition. "If the power cannot be extracted," he said, reaching out one pale hand toward her jaw, "then the vessel must be. Touch her and you die." The voice came from above. Did not echo. It did not need to. It landed in the chest cavity of every person in that room like a stone dropped into still water. And the ripples were fear. Every head turned upward. Kale stood at the gallery railing now, fully visible, both hands gripping the iron bar. His dark hair loose around his shoulders, a fresh cut above his left brow from whatever guards he had put down to get inside. He was smiling. Not the smile of a man making a bluff. The smile of a man who has already decided what happens next and finds the gap between the present moment and that outcome almost boring. Elder Voss did not remove his hand from where it hovered near Mara's face. His pride would not allow it. "You were stripped," Voss said, his voice carrying the tremble of a man trying to sound unafraid. "You have no authority in this chamber, no rank, no." "I did not say I had authority," Kale said. "I said you would die." The distinction was not lost on the room. Mara exhaled slowly through her nose. She could smell him from here. Pine and cold iron and something beneath both of those. Something older. Something that made the silver around her wrists hiss faintly against her skin as if recoiling. She had spent 6 months trying to convince him she did not need protection. She had spent those same 6 months being wrong. But not for the reasons he believed. Elder Voss made his decision. His hand closed around Mara's jaw. The silver blade rose. What happened next took 4 seconds. The torches went out. Not guttered, extinguished, all 12 simultaneously, as if something had simply decided that light was no longer permitted in this room. The temperature dropped so fast that the breath of every elder became visible in the sudden dark. Small white ghosts of panic expelled from 12 important mouths. The mud between the flagstones froze. Mara's eyes opened fully. They were not the amber gold of a shifted wolf. They were white. Completely terribly white. No iris, no pupil, just 2 apertures of cold light in the dark, and the light they cast did not illuminate anything so much as it revealed it, peeling back the shadows to show the bones of the chamber, the hairline fractures in the stone, the fear sweat on Elder Voss's upper lip, the way his heart was beating too fast, too uneven, the way his body already knew what his mind had not yet accepted. The silver blade shattered. Not bent, shattered. The fragments ringing against the stone floor like the world's smallest, most final bell. Voss stumbled back. His hand dropped from her face. The chains around Mara's wrists did not break. They dissolved. The silver-laced iron simply ceased to exist at the molecular level, leaving only a fine gray dust that drifted upward instead of falling, as if gravity, too, had received the message and decided to cooperate. In the gallery above, Kale had gone completely still. He had come here to save her. He had spent 14 months telling himself she was the vulnerability, the soft thing he needed to shield with his body and his fury and what remained of his authority. He watched the 12 most powerful wolves on the eastern continent press themselves against the curved walls of their own chamber. He watched Mara stand in the center of the room with the posture of someone who had been waiting, with extraordinary patience, for permission to stop pretending. She turned her white eyes upward toward the gallery. Toward him. When she spoke, her voice carried the resonance of something that had learned human language as a second tongue, something that had spoken in older frequencies before this and had not entirely forgotten them. "I told you," she said, "that I did not need saving." The silence in the chamber was absolute. Cale released the gallery railing. He looked at his hands, at the faint tremor there, the involuntary response of a predator recognizing, for the first time in his life, that it was also prey. And then something strange crossed his face. Not fear. Not the retreat of a man encountering something beyond his understanding. Something that looked unmistakably like wonder. "No," he said quietly. "You did not." The torches reignited. One by one. In the warm, returned light, the 12 elders of the Eastern Council looked at the girl in the center of their chamber. This girl they had chained, this girl they had intended to unmake, and understood with a clarity that only genuine terror provides that they had built the lock before they understood what it was meant to contain. Mara rolled her shoulders. The white faded from her eyes, replaced by the ordinary brown that had always made people underestimate her, and she bent down and picked up one of the silver chain fragments from the dust at her feet and turned it over in her fingers with mild curiosity, as if examining an interesting piece of debris washed up by a tide that had nothing to do with her. "I believe," she said pleasantly to no one in particular, "that this tribunal is adjourned." No one disagreed. Nobody moved for a very long time. The 12 elders of the Eastern Council stood pressed against the curved walls of their own chamber like men who had reached for a weapon and found it had become a living thing in their grip, and they did not know whether to drop it or hold on, and so they did neither. They simply stood there, breathing. Elder Voss had a hand pressed flat against his sternum, directly over his heart, the way a man does when he is taking a silent inventory of whether it is still beating correctly. He would spend the rest of the night being surprised by that. Mara set the silver chain fragment down on the mud with the careful deliberateness of someone returning a borrowed object. She straightened. She smoothed the front of her prisoner's shift. Rough gray linen, 2 sizes too large, issued to her upon arrival at the council's fortress 3 days ago. With a flat of both palms, the gesture so ordinary, so mundane, that it made the surreality of the last 4 minutes more acute by contrast. Then she walked toward the chamber's main corridor as if she had an appointment elsewhere. She had taken 4 steps before Elder Hacken found his voice. He was the youngest of the 12, barely 40, with close-cropped hair the color of river sediment, and the particular pride of a man who had climbed very far very fast and attributed all of it to merit. "You cannot simply leave," he said. The words emerged with more authority than the situation warranted. Mara stopped. She did not turn around. The back of her neck was very still. "Elder Hacken," she said. "Yes," he said. "Did you just use the word cannot with me?" The silence that followed was the sound of 12 intelligent men recalibrating. Hacken's jaw closed. Mara walked out of the chamber. The torches stayed lit. The mud between the flagstones remained frozen in perfect crystalline stillness, a record of the moment the room had understood what it was dealing with, preserved like an insect in amber. The fear, the cold, the dissolution of certainty. It would be 2 days before the temperature in that chamber returned to normal. The council would tell no one why. Cale came down from the gallery by way of the eastern staircase, which was a servant's passage, narrow enough that his shoulders brushed both walls simultaneously, smelling of tallow and disuse. He moved fast. Not running. Cale did not run from things. It was a point of something that was not quite pride and not quite stubbornness but lived in the neighborhood of both. But moving with the long, ground-eating stride of a man whose legs had been bred over generations for terrain far more demanding than a stone corridor. He caught up with her in the outer vestibule, where the fortress opened onto a covered walkway above the main courtyard, and the night air came in cold and clean and carrying the scent of pine from the forest that pressed up against the council's walls on three sides, enormous and dark and indifferent. She heard him coming. Course she did. She had always been able to hear him. She stopped at the edge of the walkway and looked out over the courtyard below, where two council guards were doing slow circuits of the perimeter with their hands at their weapons and their eyes pointed outward, away from the fortress interior, watching for threats that would come from outside the walls. They had not yet updated their threat assessment. The night smelled of pine sap and frost, and somewhere, beneath both of those, the faint sweetness of snow that had not yet fallen. Cale stopped 2 feet behind her. He stood there for a moment with a particular quality of stillness that belonged to him alone. Not the stillness of a man at rest, but the stillness of a man exerting considerable effort to remain in place when every instinct he owned was pulling in a different direction. "How long?" he said. His voice was quiet. Not the weapon voice from the gallery. Not the thing that had landed in the chests of 12 elders and rearranged something fundamental in the architecture of the room. Just his voice. Low and rough around the edges, like wood that had been weathered instead of sanded. Mara's shoulders rose and fell once. "Which part?" she asked. "All of it." She was quiet for long enough that one of the guards in the courtyard below completed a full circuit, his boots crunching on the frozen gravel, his breath a small steady cloud in the cold air. "I was born with it," she said finally. "That is not what I asked." He turned around. Her eyes were brown again, fully ordinarily brown, the color of creek water over dark stone, the color that had made people look at her and conclude she was unremarkable. He looked at her face the way he always looked at her face, which was with the focused attention of a man reading a map of territory he knows contains something he has not found yet. "You asked how long," she said. "Born with it is the answer. There is no before. There is no moment when it arrived. It has always been there. And you hid it. I managed it. From everyone. From everyone." He studied her. She watched him process this, watched the recalibration move through him like a current beneath still water, not disrupting the surface but changing the temperature. "You let me believe you were in danger," he said. "You were going to believe that regardless of what I told you," she said, and there was no accusation in it. Only the flat accuracy of someone stating a thing that is simply true. "You needed something to protect. That is not a flaw, Cale. It is just the shape of how you are built." He looked away. His jaw was tight. The muscle along the side of it jumped once. Below, the second guard completed his circuit and the two men exchanged a word that did not carry up to the walkway, something mundane, something about the watch schedule. And then they separated and continued their loops, and the night went on entirely without regard for the magnitude of what had just occurred 30 feet above and 100 feet inward. "They will not stay quiet," Cale said. "The council." "Yes." "No," Mara agreed. "They will not. Voss will send word tonight." "He already has," she said. "I could hear the messenger bird leave from the eastern tower approximately 4 minutes after I walked out." Cale turned back to her. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite alarm, not quite admiration, but somewhere between those two things, in the territory that had no clean name. "You heard it. I hear most things." He exhaled slowly through his nose. The cold air carried it away immediately. "Where does the bird go?" he asked. Mara folded her arms across her chest, not defensively, but in the way of someone settling in for a conversation that is about to become more complicated. "That," she said, "is where our problem gets significantly larger. The message would reach Aldrich Vane by morning." Cale felt this knowledge settle into him the way bad news always settled. Not with shock, because he had spent 14 months living at the edge of disaster and had long since stopped being surprised by its shape, but with a particular heaviness of a thing that has been anticipated and has arrived anyway. Aldrich Vane. The name sat in the mouth like a stone. He was not a wolf. That was the first thing people needed to understand about Aldrich Vane, because everything else about him followed from it. The way he thought, the way he moved, the way he approached problems that other men would solve with strength or speed and instead reduce to architecture, to systems, to the careful arrangement of pressure points until the thing he wanted simply had no other direction to fall. He was a seer born, one of perhaps 9 living, and the most powerful of those 9 by a margin that the others did not discuss openly because discussing it felt too much like acknowledging a weather event, useful information perhaps, but ultimately irrelevant to whether it destroyed you. He had been pursuing Mara for 3 years. Not in the way that men pursue women. In the way that collectors pursue rare objects. With patience, with methodology. With a complete absence of emotion that was more frightening than any appetite would have been. He wanted what she carried. He wanted the power. And unlike the council, who had framed it as a threat to be contained, Aldrich Vane understood it for what it actually was. Cale had known this. This was why he had been watching Mara for 6 months before she knew he was watching. This was why he had gone to the council chamber tonight with 2 knives in his boots, and the absolute conviction that he would burn the building to its foundations before he let Voss put that blade anywhere near her skin. What he had not known, what tilted the entire architecture of the last 6 months into a new and vertiginous configuration, was that the thing he had been protecting was not a vulnerability. It was a weapon. One that was already loaded. One that had always been loaded. He stood on the walkway in the cold and looked at Mara. At her ordinary brown eyes and her borrowed gray shift and her bare feet on the stone, still red from the frozen mud of the chamber, and he felt something move through him that he did not immediately have a word for. Felt like being afraid. Felt like relief. It felt, with a precision that was almost uncomfortable, like finding solid ground after a very long time of not being certain where to put your weight. "We need to move before dawn," he said. Mara nodded. "My things are in the eastern cell block," she said. "3rd corridor, 2nd door. They took my pack but they did not search it correctly." "What is in the pack?" "Things Aldrich Vane must not have." He did not ask her to elaborate. He had learned over 6 months of watching and then 4 months of something that was not watching so much as existing in deliberate proximity, that Mara offered information in the sequence she judged most necessary, and pressing her for a different sequence was like trying to make water run uphill. Theoretically a conversation one could have, practically a waste of energy. "I know a way out," he said. "The drainage culvert under the western foundation," she said. "Yes. I found it on my first day." He was quiet for a moment. "Do you need me at all?" he asked. It was not self-pity. It was a genuine question, asked with the directness of a man who needs accurate information about the structure of a situation in order to navigate it correctly. Mara looked at him for a long moment. The pine-scented wind moved between them. "Yes," she said. He waited. "Not for the reasons you thought," she added. "But yes." He accepted this. It was, in some ways, more than he had expected. "Get your pack," he said. "Meet me at the Western Foundation in 10 minutes." She was already moving. The drainage culvert was exactly as unpleasant as its description suggested. It was wide enough for a person to move through on hands and knees, and it smelled of standing water and rot and the accumulated runoff of a fortress that had been in continuous occupation for 200 years. The water was 3 inches deep and approximately 1 degree above freezing. Mara moved through it without a sound, the pack she had retrieved from the cell block slung across her back, sealed tight with waxed leather straps. Cale moved behind her. His knees hit the stone floor with each forward movement, and the cold water soaked through his trousers immediately, and the smell was genuinely terrible. And he noted all of these things and filed them under the category of things that were happening and were not relevant to survival, and therefore required no further attention. 40 feet. Juicy. The darkness in the culvert was total. No torchlight reached here, no moonlight, nothing. And Cale navigated by the sound of Mara's movement ahead of him and the faint, clean scent of her that cut through the rot and the cold water the way a tuning fork cuts through noise. He had never told her that he could always find her by scent. She had never told him she knew anyway. These were the kinds of things they did not say to each other, and the accumulation of them over 6 months had built something between them that was not quite trust and was not quite anything else either, but was structural, somehow, in a way that the named things often were not. The culvert opened onto the eastern bank of the creek that ran along the base of the fortress's outer wall. The water here was moving, black and quick between ice-edged banks, and it smelled of iron and pine and the cold particular smell of a winter that had fully committed. They emerged and stood in the dark. Above them, the fortress wall rose 30 feet, and at its top, a guard was moving. His footsteps regular, undisturbed, looking outward at the tree line where the forest began approximately 40 yards away. Mara was already studying the tree line. Her eyes had changed again. Not the full white of the chamber. Something intermediate. The brown had taken on a faint luminescence, barely visible, more of a quality than a color, like the difference between still water and water with something moving very slowly beneath its surface. "There is a scout," she said quietly. Cale followed her gaze. The forest was dark and impenetrable to human sight. To wolf sight, in full shift, he might have seen movement at 80 yards. He could see nothing from here. "Where?" he said. 60 yards. 2 o'clock from the largest pine at the tree line's edge. He stared. He still could not see it. "Veins?" he asked. "Not council," she said. "The council's scouts smell like the fortress. Pine resin and old stone. This one smells like," she paused, her nostrils flaring slightly, her head tilting in a way that was not quite human. "River clay and something chemical. Something synthesized." Cale's hand moved to the knife at his belt. "Vein uses sear-touched trackers," he said. "They mask their natural scent with a compound derived from nullroot," Mara said. "Yes. Except nullroot has a specific molecular signature that is actually more distinctive to me than a natural scent would be. It is like trying to hide a candle by building a brighter one." She said this without smugness. It was again simply a fact. Cale's hand did not leave the knife. "If they have a scout here already," he said carefully, then Vane did not wait for Voss's message. "No," Mara said. "He knew we would be here tonight." "He knew I would be here," she corrected. "He has been tracking my movement for 3 years. He likely predicted the council's move before the council made it. And he positioned assets in advance." He positioned assets in advance. The creek moved past them, quick and cold and indifferent. Somewhere in the forest, 60 yards away and slightly to the right, a sear-touched tracker was waiting with a chemical compound on their skin and the specific coordinates of Mara's existence. Cale ran the arithmetic of the situation. 1 scout visible to Mara's perception meant a minimum of 3 more that she had not yet located. Standard Vane methodology. Always 4 points of a compass, always redundancy, always the trap dressed as the obvious exit. The culvert behind them was now a known quantity. The fortress above them was hostile. The forest ahead of them contained at least 1 enemy. He looked at Mara. She was looking at the forest with the calm, luminescent focus of someone reading a page of text, and he understood, with a clarity that was still new enough to be slightly destabilizing, that she was not reading the visible dark. She was reading something else entirely. "How many?" he asked. "4," she said. "The same as you were calculating." He absorbed this. "Can you determine their positions?" "I already have." "And?" She finally turned to look at him. The creek light caught her eyes, that barely there luminescence, and for a moment she looked like something that had been in the world for considerably longer than 22 years. "Cale," she said. "Yes. I need to tell you something before we go into that forest." "Tell me while we move." "No," she said. "Now." The seriousness in her voice was different from her usual seriousness. Her usual seriousness was the tone of precision, the particular register of someone who chooses words carefully because imprecision has a cost. This was something underneath that. This was the tone of something she had been carrying for a long time. He turned fully toward her. The wind moved through the pine trees above the fortress wall and brought the cold down with it, and he stood in the freezing water at the edge of the creek and gave her his complete attention. "What happened in the chamber," she said, "was a fraction." He was still. "A fraction," he repeated. "I managed it. Kept it small. Precisely because there were witnesses and because the political consequences of the full scope would have been." She searched for the word. "Irreversible." "What does the full scope look like?" She held his gaze. "You know the harrowing of Dunmore?" she asked. Every wolf knew the harrowing of Dunmore. It was 300 years ago. It was the reason the Eastern Council existed. An entire region. 4 packs, 2 human settlements, thousands of acres of forest, had been reduced to scorched stone and white ash in a single night by a power that the historical records described in terms that scholars had always assumed were metaphorical. A light that was not light. Cold that was not cold. The dissolution of the boundary between what existed and what did not. The records described it as the land itself forgetting what it was supposed to be. Cale looked at Mara. At her ordinary brown eyes with their barely there luminescence. At her bare feet on the frozen creek bank. At the pack on her back sealed tight, containing things Aldrich Vane must not have. "You are not," he said slowly, "the first." "No," she said. "There have been others. 2 recorded. 1 suspected. The power does not breed, it appears. Spontaneously. Rarely. And it is not," she said, with a precision that made clear this distinction was important to her, "destructive by nature. The harrowing of Dunmore happened because the person who carried it was 17 years old and cornered and terrified, and had never once been taught how to breathe through it." The creek moved. The trees moved. 60 yards away, a tracker with nullroot on their skin waited in the dark. "How old were you," Cale said quietly, "when you first understood what it was?" Mara looked at the water. 8, she said. "What happened?" "Nothing," she said. "Because I was not 17 and cornered. I was 8 years old and I had an extraordinarily patient grandmother who had seen something like it once, a long time before, and she sat with me in a cold room for 6 hours and taught me to breathe through it." The weight of this settled over him. Years old. 14 years of breathing through it. 14 years of ordinary brown eyes and the deliberate, precise management of something that could reduce a landscape to ash. "Your grandmother," he said. "Gone," she said. 4 years ago. Did she tell anyone?" "She told me to tell no one." He nodded slowly. "She was right." "She was right," Mara agreed. Above them, the fortress guard completed another circuit. Below the scout line, somewhere in the dark, one of Vane's 4 trackers shifted their weight, and a single pine branch exhaled a soft sound under the pressure of their boot, barely audible, irrelevant to anyone who was not Mara. She heard it. Her eyes tracked left. The southern position is moving, she said, and her voice had shifted back into the register of precise tactical information. They have a communication window in the next 4 minutes. If they report to Vane that they have visual confirmation, he will not wait. He will move on us directly, Cale said. Tonight, she confirmed. He pulled the knife from his belt. It was a good knife, council steel, which he appreciated with the uncomplicated pragmatism of a man who had lived by the quality of his tools. And the moonlight caught the blade, and for one moment it threw a thin silver line across the frozen bank. He looked at it. He looked at Mara. I need to know one thing, he said. Yes, she said before he could ask it. He looked at her. I will not lose control, she said. Not in the forest. Not with 4 trackers and Aldrich Vane's network and whatever he sends next. I will not become Dunmore. That is not what I was going to ask, he said. She blinked. It was, he noted, the first time in 6 months he had surprised her. Something moved across her face. Brief, unguarded, there and gone. What were you going to ask, she said. The creek moved between its ice-edged banks. The forest waited. Cale slid the knife back into his belt. I was going to ask, he said, whether you trust me. The silence between them had a different texture than the silence of the past 6 months. That silence had been the silence of 2 people maintaining careful distances. This one was the silence of a distance closing. Yes, she said. No qualification. No because or despite or in this specific context. Just yes. He turned toward the tree line. Then stay close, he said. Not because you need protecting. Because we move faster together, she finished. Yes. She came to stand beside him, the pack squared on her back, her eyes returned to full luminescence now, reading the dark forest with its 4 hidden points of pressure, and Cale stood next to her with the cold creek behind them and the fortress above them and the smell of pine and frost and nullroot ahead, and he felt the ground beneath his feet, frozen, certain, solid, and he understood that the shape of everything had changed tonight. Not broken. Changed. He had come here to save a girl he believed was vulnerable. He had found something that had been waiting, with extraordinary patience, for the world to be ready to see what it actually was. He was not certain the world was ready. He was certain he was. On your mark, he said. Mara exhaled once. The luminescence in her eyes steadied to a clear, cold light. Now, she said. They moved into the dark. The forest did not stop them. Nothing in the forest stopped them. They moved through the pine dark like 2 halves of a single decision, Cale reading the ground. The frost-hardened roots, the frozen stream crossings, the places where the snow had compacted into ice beneath a deceptive dusting of fresh powder, and Mara reading everything else. The 4 trackers never got their communication window. She made certain of it. Not with violence. With something quieter and more absolute. A displacement of attention, a subtle redirection of perception that left each tracker standing in the dark, suddenly uncertain of what they had seen, what they had heard, whether the shape they had been following was ever really there. Cale watched her do this from 6 feet away and felt the hairs on his forearms rise beneath his sleeves. Not from fear. From the specific, bone-deep recognition of witnessing something that should not be possible and is happening anyway, right in front of you in the ordinary dark of an ordinary forest. They ran for 3 hours. East, then north, then east again, following a route that Cale had memorized 14 months ago when he understood that the council would eventually move against everything he valued, and he needed to know the land better than they did. The forest gave way to the moorland at approximately 4 in the morning. The tree line ending with the sudden decisiveness of a sentence stopped mid-word, and the moor opened before them. Vast and black and bone-cold, the frozen heather crunching under their feet, the sky above them enormous and salted with stars that burned with a particular indifference of things that have been watching human disasters for considerably longer than humans have been having them. They did not speak for a long time. There was a shelter, not a building, barely a structure, a shepherd's stone refuge half sunk into the moor's edge, that Cale had stocked 8 months ago with dry clothes and food and a fire kit and the specific items a person needed to disappear effectively. He had stocked it for one. He had brought 2 sets of everything anyway. He had not examined his reasons for that at the time. He examined them now briefly, and then set the examination aside. Inside, with a small fire built in the stone basin and the wind shut out by walls that had survived 2 centuries of moorland weather, Mara opened her pack. Cale sat across from her and watched. She removed 7 items. A journal, old, its leather cover worn smooth, filled with a handwriting that was not hers, which meant it had belonged to her grandmother. 3 vials of something clear, each one sealed with black wax pressed with a thumbprint. A compass that did not point north. Its needle moved in slow, irregular arcs, tracking something that was not magnetic. A map on cloth so fine it was nearly translucent. A single black stone, smooth and oval, that she set down with more care than she had given any of the other objects. And a letter sealed, addressed in handwriting Cale did not recognize, to a name that made him go still. His name. Cale Dunmore. He looked at the letter. He looked at Mara. "Your grandmother," he said. "She wrote it 6 years before she died," Mara said. "She told me to give it to the fallen Alpha when the time came. She knew I would fall. She knew someone like you would exist," Mara said carefully. "She said the power always finds its counterpart. She said there would be someone who could stand next to it without flinching and without trying to own it. She said that person would be stripped of their rank and would not be broken by the stripping." He looked at the letter for a long moment. Then he picked it up and broke the seal. The handwriting inside was the same as the journal. Precise, unhurried. The handwriting of a woman who had lived a long time and had stopped wasting motion. He read it once. Then he sat very still. "What does it say?" Mara asked. He looked up. "She says that what you carry is not a power," he said. "Not in the way that word is used. She says it is a correction." Mara frowned. "A correction," she repeated. "She says the world accumulates damage," he said, reading more slowly now, following the old woman's logic through the careful architecture of her sentences. "Over centuries. Over the accumulation of violence and broken laws and the specific damage done when the strong destroy the weak because they can. She says the world develops," she uses the word wounds. "Deep wounds. In the fabric of what should be." He paused. "And occasionally it generates something to close them." The fire moved between them. Mara sat with her hands open on her knees, looking at him with eyes that were fully luminescent now, not controlled, not managed, just present. The real thing, not the disguise, and the light they cast made the shadows in the shelter soft and strange. "She is describing me as a function," Mara said. "No," Cale said. He set the letter down. "She is describing you as a choice," he said. "She is very specific about this. She says the power does not act, does not move on its own. It waits for the person who carries it to decide. It is not a force of nature. It is not a correction that happens to a person. It is a correction that a person chooses to make." The fire snapped once. The wind pressed against the outside of the shelter's walls and found no way in. Mara was quiet for a very long time. Then she picked up the black stone. She held it in both hands, her thumbs resting against its smooth surface, and she looked at it with the expression of someone who has been carrying a thing for so long that they have stopped seeing it clearly and are only now, in the right light, beginning to understand its actual shape. "I have been so afraid," she said. Her voice was quiet. Not the tactical voice, not the precise voice, not the voice that delivered information with the clean efficiency of someone who has learned that precision is protection. Just her voice. Young and tired and truthful. "Of losing control," Cale said. "Of being done more," she said. "Of being the thing that ends everything by accident. Of breathing wrong at the wrong moment and—" She stopped. "You are not going to be done more," he said. "You do not know that." "I know you have been breathing correctly for 14 years, he said. "I know your grandmother spent 6 hours with you in a cold room when you were 8 years old and you came out of it intact. I know that tonight in that chamber, with 12 wolves and silver chains and a blade at your face, you kept it small on purpose." She looked at him. "I know," he said, "that control is not the absence of power. It is the presence of a person who has decided what the power is for." The stone in her hands did not warm. It was not that kind of stone. But she held it steadily, and the luminescence in her eyes steadied with it, and the fire between them burned clean and orange and ordinary. Outside, the moor stretched for miles in every direction. And somewhere at its far northern edge, where the moorland met the broken escarpment that the old maps called the Voreth Rise, Aldrich Vane was waiting. They knew by dawn. Not from the trackers. Those were still wandering in confused circles somewhere in the forest, their sense of purpose quietly dismantled. But from the compass. Mara watched its needle, and her face went very still in the way that meant she was receiving information rather than processing it. The slight unfocus of someone reading something too large to hold in ordinary attention. "He has the council," she said. Cale was already on his feet. "All 12. What remains of them?" she said. "Voss. Akin. 7 others. He has had 3 of them for months. They have been feeding him information." He paused. "He has something else." The compass needle was spinning. Not slowly the way it usually moved. Rest. Agitated. The needle hitting its limits on each rotation with a small, frantic click. "What else?" Cale said. She set the compass down. "He has found the other one," she said. The silence was total. "There is another," Cale said. "My grandmother suspected," Mara said. "Someone unmanaged. Someone who has never had 6 hours in a cold room. Someone who has been in Vane's possession for—" She closed her eyes. The luminescence behind the lids was faintly visible, a soft cold light beneath skin. Long enough that they no longer remember what they were before he found them. Cale thought about what a seer-born collector would do with an unmanaged version of Mara's power. He thought about it for exactly as long as he needed to, and then he stopped thinking about it because the thinking was not useful and the moving was. "How far is the Voreth Rise?" "On foot 6 hours," she said. "But we are not going on foot." She opened her eyes. She looked at him with the full weight of what she was. Not managed, not reduced, not fitted into the shape of something less threatening. "I need you to shift," she said. He had not shifted in 14 months. When they stripped his title, they had not taken his wolf. They could not, it was not a thing that could be legislated away. But he had not shifted because shifting felt, in the months after the falling, like opening a room that contained something he was not ready to be in the same space with. The grief of it. The grief of what he had been and what had been taken. He looked at Mara. She looked back. "Cale," she said. "Yes. You are not the fallen alpha," she said. He was very still. "You are the alpha who fell," she said, "and got back up." The fire was nearly out. The dawn light was coming through the shelter's low entrance, pale and cold and committed, the kind of light that does not ask permission. He stepped outside. The more air hit him, pine and frost and the iron smell of frozen heather, and beneath it all the vast, cold, living smell of a landscape that had been here before every human decision and would be here after the last one. He breathed it. He let the grief come because she was right and it was time. He felt the bones in his spine realign. He felt the shift begin. Hurt. It always hurt, the first time after a long absence. Not the physical change, the body knew its way through that. But the emotional tearing of a door being opened that had been kept shut, the sudden flood of everything that had been stored behind it. He let it hurt. He did not rush it. And then the large black wolf stood on the frozen moor in the dawn light, and his silver eyes were the same as they had always been. And Mara came out of the shelter and looked at him, and something moved across her face that she did not have the architecture to conceal. She put her hand on his head, his neck, the rough warmth of him. "There you are," she said quietly. He turned toward the north. She climbed onto his back. And they ran. The Vorith Rise arrived the way all significant places arrive when they are the site of something that cannot be undone. Gradually and then all at once, the escarpment materializing out of the gray morning like a thought becoming a certainty, its broken stone face rising from the moorland with the finality of a wall. Aldrich Vane was at its base. He was a tall man. That was always the first thing people noticed and always the least important thing about him. He stood in the center of a formation, 9 council members in a wide arc behind him. His own people in a tighter configuration to his left and right, and in front of all of them, kneeling in the frozen ground, a figure that made Mara's breath leave her body the moment she saw it. Boy. Perhaps 16. His eyes were white. Fully, completely white, the same as hers had been in the chamber. But static, locked, as if he had been held open at that pitch for so long that the mechanism for closing had been removed. He was not shaking. He was past shaking. He was in the particular stillness of someone who has expended everything. Mara slid from Cale's back. Her feet met the frozen ground. The boy's head turned toward her. His sightless white eyes found her with a precision that had nothing to do with sight. He recognized her. Not her face. Her frequency. She felt it. The reaching, the desperate orientation of something that had been alone in a frequency no one else shared, for the entire duration of its conscious life, suddenly perceiving that it is not the only thing of its kind. The sound that came from him was not a word. It was not quite human. It was the sound of a person who stopped believing in rescue so long ago that the arrival of it has broken something in the architecture of their endurance. Aldrich Vane smiled. It was a precise smile, measured. The smile of a man who had designed a situation and is observing it perform as designed. "Mara," he said. He had a pleasant voice. That had always been the most unsettling thing about him. The pleasantness, the complete congruence between his appearance and the behavior of a reasonable man, the way evil had decided in his case, to wear something comfortable. "I have spent 3 years preparing for this conversation," he said. "You have spent 3 years preparing for an outcome," Mara said. "The conversation is new." He tilted his head. "You managed it," he said, with the tone of a man examining a technique. "In the council chamber. Beautifully managed. I watched the report from my observer and I thought, she is extraordinary. She is wasted on subtlety." "What you call subtlety," she said, "I call not destroying everything I touch." "But imagine," he said, and his voice carried the warmth of genuine enthusiasm, the particular fervor of a man in love with his own vision. What could be built in the aftermath? Imagine the structures that could be raised on ground cleared of the old rot. The council. The hierarchy. The entire calcified order of a world that has been run by the same 14 families for 300 years. He spread his hands. You are not a weapon, Mara. You are a foundation. For your architecture, she said. For something better than this. For something yours, she said. He paused. He looked at her. The pleasant smile stayed exactly where it was. The boy, he said, has been with me for 2 years. He is not managed. He is not trained. He is, in his current state, approximately as stable as a fault line. He glanced at the kneeling figure. I have been very careful about the conditions under which he exists. A precise and caring environment. It would be a great shame if those conditions were to become. The pause was deliberate. Less precise. Mara understood the threat. An unmanaged version of her power, destabilized, in a teenage boy who was already past his limits. She understood what that looked like. She understood the scale of it. She felt Cale move up beside her. Back in human form now, she had not heard the shift. He was simply there, solid and present. His shoulder 6 inches from hers. She felt his warmth. She felt the absolute steadiness of him. She thought about what her grandmother had written. Correction. Not a function. Voice. She looked at the boy. She looked at the white static of his eyes. The vacancy of someone who has been held open at an unsustainable pitch. The 2 years of isolation in a frequency he had no language for. She made the choice. Not to destroy. To reach. She opened herself. Not a fraction. Not the managed, precisely calibrated fraction she had maintained for 14 years. All of it. The full scope. It did not look like what Vane was expecting. He had expected she could see it in the microsecond of his recalibration, something explosive. The Dunmore template, the light that was not light, the cold that was not cold, the dissolution of the boundary between what existed and what did not. What happened instead was silence. A silence with weight. A silence with temperature and texture and the specific quality of a presence that is so much larger than its context that the context simply stops mattering. The frozen heather did not burn. The stone did not crack. The 9 council members did not move. Not from fear precisely, but from something that preceded fear, something the body registers before the mind has processed it, the cellular recognition of being in proximity to something that is operating at a scale that renders your ordinary categories of response irrelevant. Mara walked forward, past Vane, past his people, past the arc of elders who stood with their mouths slightly open. She walked to the boy. She knelt in the frozen ground in front of him and she took his face in her hands and she looked into his white static eyes at point-blank range and she said, in the frequency that only they shared, not aloud, not in any language that had a written form or a spoken one, she said, I know what this is. I know how long you have been in it. I know that no one ever sat with you in a cold room. I'm here now. The boy's breath hitched. Once. The static in his eyes moved. Breathe, she said, in the frequency. He breathed. She breathed with him. The full scope of what she carried moved around them both like water around 2 stones in a current. Not destroying, not consuming, but accommodating, finding the shape of 2 presences and making room for both of them within itself. She felt his power, wild and terrified and vast and completely untrained, 14 months younger than hers, a door that had been blown open instead of opened, a room that had never had a threshold. She did not take it. She did not contain it. She simply stayed next to it. The way her grandmother had stayed next to hers. For 6 hours in a cold room when she was 8 years old. Breathing. Here. Not alone. The white faded from the boy's eyes. Not all at once. In the way that light actually fades. Gradually, the edges first, the center last, the change so incremental that you could not have named the moment it happened, only the before and the after. Brown eyes. Ordinary brown eyes, red-rimmed, exhausted. 2 years deep in something no 16-year-old should have survived. He looked at her. He said nothing. He did not need to. She kept her hands on his face for a moment longer. Then she stood. He turned around. Aldrich Vane had not moved. The pleasant smile was gone. What had replaced it was not anger. It was the expression of a man watching his architecture disassemble itself. Not being destroyed, not being attacked, simply ceasing to hold because the assumption it was built on had been quietly and completely removed. He had assumed she would fight him. He had designed for a weapon. She was not a weapon. She never had been. She was something that weapons did not have a category for. She looked at him with her ordinary brown eyes, and they were just ordinary brown eyes now. Creek water over dark stone, and she said, "You built a prison around something you did not understand and called it preparation." He said nothing. "The boy is leaving with me," she said. "You cannot," he began. "Cale," she said. She did not look behind her. She did not need to. Cale moved past her. He moved the way the wolf moved when it was not performing speed but was simply committed, with the absolute, unhurried, terminal certainty of something that has identified its direction and removed the concept of obstacle from its operational vocabulary. He took Aldrich Vane apart with the efficiency of a man who has been waiting a very long time to do exactly this, and has had the discipline to wait for the right moment. It was not a long process. When it was finished, Vane was on the ground, breathing. Cale was not cruel. He had never been cruel. He looked down at the man who had spent 3 years hunting Mara across the full geography of the Eastern Territory, and he felt nothing that required expression, and so he expressed nothing, and he stepped back and he looked at the 9 council elders who remained standing in their arc. They looked back at him. He said nothing. He did not need to. They understood, with a clarity that only genuine moral reckoning provides, that the order they had served and protected, and in some cases corrupted, had made a sequence of decisions that had led to this specific frozen morning on this specific moorland escarpment, and that the accounting for those decisions was not going to be paid by anyone other than themselves. Elder Voss, to his credit, looked directly at Mara. "What do you want?" he said. Not a negotiation. Not a position. A genuine question, asked by a man who had finally understood that he was not the one setting the terms. Mara looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the boy, who was sitting on the frozen ground behind her, pulling his knees to his chest, breathing in the careful new rhythm she had given him. His brown eyes moving across the moorland with the tentative attention of someone relearning how to look at the world without flinching. "A different world," she said. "That is not something I can." "You can begin one," she said. "That is all I am asking. Begin it." Voss was quiet for a long time. The moorland wind moved over all of them, cold and impartial and carrying the smell of pine from somewhere far south and snow from somewhere far north, and the particular smell of a morning that has witnessed something it will carry forward in its temperature and its light for a very long time. "Yes," Voss said. He said it the way old men say the things they should have said decades earlier, with the weight of the delay in every syllable, and the knowledge that beginning late is not the same as not beginning, and the fragile, necessary hope that the difference still matters. "Yes," he said again. "We can begin one." They walked south. All 3 of them. Cale and Mara and the boy whose name was Eli, who was 16 years old and had not walked freely in 2 years and who kept stopping to look at things. A frost pattern on a heather stem, a bird crossing the gray sky. The way the morning light was beginning to shift the moorland from black to purple to the specific amber gold that meant the sun was committing to the day. He looked at these things with the concentrated attention of someone rebuilding an inventory, recataloguing the world. Mara walked beside him and did not rush him. Cale walked on his other side and did not rush him either. They did not speak for a long time. Eventually Eli looked up at Mara and said, in a voice that was still finding its footing, still relearning the passage from internal to external, "Does it ever stop feeling so large?" She considered this honestly, the way her grandmother had always considered her questions honestly. "No," she said, "but you stop being afraid of how large it is. And then it becomes something else." "What does it become?" She looked at the moorland ahead of them, at the way the amber light was moving across its surface now, changing it, the frozen heather beginning to catch the warmth and release the night's cold and thin rising wisps, the whole vast landscape in the process of becoming the day's version of itself. "Yours," she said. Eli was quiet. Then he nodded. He looked at the light on the heather and he breathed carefully in the new rhythm, and it held. Cale looked at Mara over the boy's head. She looked back. There was nothing in their faces that required words, and so there were none, and the silence between them was not the silence of the past 6 months, not the silence of two people maintaining careful distances, but the silence of two people who have arrived finally at the same place at the same time, and have the extraordinary good sense to stand still and let themselves be there. They walked south. The sun climbed. The moorland opened before them in every direction, ancient and cold and indifferent and vast, and they were 3 small figures moving across its surface in the early light. A fallen alpha who had fallen upward, a girl who had been breathing through the weight of the world since she was 8 years old, and a boy who was only now learning how. And the world, which had been accumulating its damage for a very long time, felt something it had not felt in 300 years. The particular stillness of a wound beginning to close. They would say later in the stories told in the packs along the Eastern Territory, told first in whispers, then aloud, then with a particular reverence that truth develops when it has survived long enough to become legend, that the fallen alpha and the girl with the white eyes had saved the world. This was not quite right. She had not saved the world. She had reminded it what it was for. There is a difference, and it matters, and she would have wanted that distinction made. She would have said it quietly, in the precise voice, without emphasis, because precision was her form of care. She would have said, "I did not save anything. I only stayed." And sometimes, when the damage is deep enough and the dark is long enough and every force that prefers the wound to the closing is arrayed against the thing that would heal it, sometimes, staying is the bravest and the largest and the most world-altering thing a person can do. She stayed. And because she stayed, so did everything else.